Welcome to the first online learning session. In this session we're going to be becoming acquainted with Paul's personal and theological background, and this is just going to help us to understand some of the points that Paul's making and understand his presentation of the gospel a little bit better. So the first question we need to ask is, who was Paul? Well, Paul came from Tarsus, and he was a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin and also a Roman citizen. And it's likely that he kind of grew up learning about his Jewish heritage in the city of Tarsus before moving to Jerusalem to be formally trained. Now, Tarsus was a religiously, politically, culturally, socially diverse city. And so Paul, in his secular work environment, working in a shop making tents, is going to have been in conversation with people with wildly different worldviews from his, learning about theirs and arguing with them about his. Now, there are two key places in the New Testament that we learn about Paul. One of those places is the book of Acts, and the other is in his own letters that he wrote to his various churches. So according to Acts, Paul was educated by the Rabbi Gamaliel in Jerusalem. And Gamaliel had this very relaxed view of what it meant to be an obedient Jew. And he kind of adopted an idea that we'll do Torah and the Romans are just going to do as the Romans are going to do. By contrast, Paul became a zealous Pharisee, and he had an exceptionally strict understanding of what it meant to follow the Jewish legal codes. And he went to the point of even inciting violence against people who didn't follow them and adhere to them strictly. So we then find in Acts, and mentioned throughout Paul's letters, a picture of Paul in his life as the Pharisee Saul, kind of travelling around Judea, persecuting Christians for being heretical, for undermining what it meant to be Jewish. But he had this dramatic experience on the road to Damascus of the risen Jesus, who asked him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And after this, Paul's thrust on this wildly different path. He starts travelling a lot. He's preaching, he's baptizing people, planting churches. He gets imprisoned really quite a lot. But he also, in that time, wrote quite a few letters to the churches that he had planted. So the next question to ask is, what factors were influencing Paul's Christian message in his presentation of the gospel? Well, something that's important to recognise is that Paul obviously wasn't one of the 12 disciples who walked with Jesus during his earthly ministry. He also wasn't based out of the church in Jerusalem, where Peter was. He was commissioned by a church in Antioch. So, although there are features of Paul's teaching that overlap with what's found in the letters from the other New Testament apostles, Paul was trained by a different group of Christians, commissioned by a different church, and so possibly came at the gospel from his own angle and with his own different perspective. And we can kind of see this because Paul responds in his letters to charges from people who were questioning his authority as an apostle. Why should we listen to this guy? He wasn't even one of the original 12. And he is insistent that his fundamental gospel message was the same as the other apostles. And in his letter to the Galatians, he even goes so far as to say he received some of what he was teaching through direct divine revelation. However, some scholars, like Ziesler, have argued that it's implausible to suggest that when Paul met Peter for a fortnight in Jerusalem, they never once talked about or discussed Christian theology or the things that Peter saw when he was travelling with Jesus. And so it's more likely, in their view, that Paul is referring to Galatians, in Galatians, to his own particular angle on the gospel message being revealed through direct divine revelation. And kind of in this, there's this interesting recognition that Paul seems to be relatively unfamiliar with the teaching of Jesus. There are 5 places in 1 Corinthians, 1 Thessalonians and Romans where Paul seems to directly reference something of Jesus' teachings. And that's when he's talking about divorce, receiving payment for proclaiming the gospel, the Lord's Supper, on Jesus' coming, and on things that are seen as unclean. Other than those occasions, it seems that Paul is either unaware of a lot of what's found in the Gospels, or he just simply doesn't use the things that he's learnt. Or in Ziesler's words, Paul either does not know he's echoing the Jesus tradition, or if he knows, chooses not to acknowledge his indebtedness. But whatever the case, Paul must have known enough about the Christian community's message to know enough that he wanted to persecute them and that they were doing something that he thought was wrong. So his conviction that he knows the gospel message as well as the other apostles is clear. And the way that he works that into practical advice in theology that's consistent with the rest of the picture of Jesus in the Gospels shows that he's not just some maverick on his own hobby horse, but that he really knows what he's talking about. But why does any of this matter? Well, knowing the background of an author will help us to understand why they may have said some of the things they said, and also help us to understand the reason they may value certain things over others. So one example of this is that as a Hellenistic Jew, Paul is particularly concerned with showing that God's not abandoned the Israelites, but instead that their relationship has changed from one based on law to one based on grace. And in fact, Paul still saw himself as a Jew. Again, Ziesler, he says, his conversion was not from Judaism, but from what he came to regard as an outmoded form of it, to what he believed was its true fulfillment. Additionally, as a person familiar with Greek philosophy and the way of Greek argumentation, it's logical that Paul would then use that style of argument when he's responding to issues and questions from Greek-influenced believers. Furthermore, it's useful to have an idea of the stage that Paul was at in his own ministry when he wrote certain letters. Each of the communities that he was responding to had their own issues and their own questions. And the longer he'd been in his own Christian walk, the better equipped he's going to be to respond to those questions. For our mission and ministry today, this is crucial because it shows that we all have something to offer, no matter what our backgrounds might be or how long on our walk with Christ we are. So in our next lecture, we're going to start to look at a few key terms that are going to help us to be more specific about Paul's theology and what he talks about. But for now, I'll just recap a few of the main points from here. So Paul was born in Tarsus of Jewish descent. He trained as a Pharisee in Jerusalem. He wasn't one of the original 12, and he was associated with the church in Antioch, not the church in Jerusalem. His heritage as a devout Jew had a significant impact on the way he presented the gospel and on his theology. And this is important because it's going to help us to understand our own positions and the person behind Paul's letters. So that brings us to the end of this first online learning session. I hope you find the follow-up tasks useful, and I will see you in the next lecture.